Elena arrived at the family estate just before sunset, her old car kicking up a trail of dust on the unpaved road. The mansion stood at the edge of the village, surrounded by gnarled trees that seemed to twist and lean toward the house. The air felt heavy, like a storm was brewing, though the sky was clear. As she stepped out of the car, she felt a strange unease settle over her. The house had always been intimidating, but now it seemed to breathe with a life of its own. Inside, the atmosphere was no better. The wooden floors creaked under her boots and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. Her uncle greeted her at the door, his face as stern as she remembered. He offered a curt nod and gestured for her to follow him into the dimly lit parlor. The room hadn't changed in years. Ornate furniture that looked untouched, heavy drapes that blocked out the setting sun, and a collection of family portraits that seemed to watch her every move. "We didn't think you'd come," he said without looking at her. "I wasn't planning to," Elena replied, setting her bag down. "But I had to. It's family." The word tasted bitter on her tongue. Her uncle didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the fireplace where embers glowed faintly. She noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed against the armrest of his chair. Something was wrong, but he wasn't going to tell her. Not yet. That night, Elena was given a small room at the end of the upstairs hall. It felt cold, despite the heavy blankets on the bed, and the faint sound of wind rattling the window made it hard to relax. She lay staring at the ceiling, wondering why she had bothered to come back after all these years. The family had never welcomed her, not after her mother disappeared. They spoke in half-truths and quiet whispers, and she was always left on the outside trying to piece together fragments of a story that no one wanted to tell. Her thoughts were interrupted by a strange glow filtering through the curtains. At first, she thought it was the moon, but the light was too steady, too warm. She sat up and peered out the window, her breath catching in her throat. There, at the far edge of the property, past the overgrown garden and the crooked fence, was the family graveyard. One grave glowed faintly, its light soft and pulsing like a heartbeat. Elena stared, her heart racing. She couldn't remember ever hearing about a glowing grave. She opened the window to get a better look, the cool night air brushing against her skin. The grave stood out among the others, its light illuminating the surrounding tombstones in a ghostly haze. For a moment she thought she saw movement near it, but when she blinked, it was gone. The sight left her restless. She closed the window and lay back down, but the image of the glowing grave stayed with her. She didn't know why, but it felt like it was calling to her, pulling her toward it. She tried to shake the feeling, but sleep wouldn't come. In the morning, over a sparse breakfast, she asked about the grave. "Why does one of the graves glow at night?" she said, trying to sound casual. The room fell silent. Her uncle set down his coffee cup with a deliberate clink, and her aunt shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Her cousin Sarah looked up from her plate, her face pale. "It's nothing," her uncle said, his tone sharp. "Stay away from it." "But," Elena began. "I said, stay away," he snapped, his eyes narrowing. "There are things you don't understand, and it's better that way." Elena bit her tongue, but the curiosity inside her burned brighter. Her family had always been this way, hiding things, shutting her out. But she wasn't a child anymore. She wasn't going to let them keep her in the dark. That night, when the house was quiet and everyone else had gone to bed, she would find out for herself what they were hiding. Elena waited in her room as the house fell into silence. The old walls groaned softly, settling into the stillness of the night. She sat by the window, her eyes fixed on the glowing grave in the distance. It seemed brighter now, the light cutting through the darkness like a beacon. Every instinct told her to stay put, to heed her uncle's warning, but curiosity had already taken hold. Whatever secrets her family was hiding, she needed to know. She slipped on her coat and eased the door open, careful not to make a sound. The hallway stretched out before her, dim and shadowy, the faint creak of the floorboards beneath her feet the only noise. She descended the staircase slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. When she reached the front door, she paused, listening for any sign of movement. The house was silent, save for the faint ticking of a clock in the parlor. Elena stepped outside, the cold air biting at her cheeks. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, twisted shadows across the yard. The graveyard loomed ahead, surrounded by a rusted iron fence half hidden by overgrown ivy. The glowing grave stood out vividly, its light washing over the surrounding tombstones in an eerie golden hue. She pushed open the creaking gate and stepped inside, her breath visible in the frigid air. As she approached the grave, the glow seemed to pulse, almost as if it were alive. The name on the headstone was barely legible, worn away by time, but she could make out faint letters. Annabelle Mallory. The name was unfamiliar, yet it sent a strange shiver down her spine. She knelt beside the grave, her fingers brushing the cold, damp soil. The light intensified for a moment, and she thought she heard something. A faint whisper, so soft she almost missed it. "Help me." Elena froze, her heart pounding. She glanced around, but the graveyard was empty. The whisper came again, faint and pleading. She leaned closer to the grave, her breath quickening. The light from the grave flickered, casting shadows that danced across the headstones. "Who are you?" Elena whispered, her voice trembling. The air felt heavier, pressing down on her like a weight. The whisper didn't answer, but the ground beneath her seemed to hum faintly, as though responding to her presence. She pulled back, her instincts screaming at her to leave, but she couldn't. Something about the grave, about Annabelle, felt connected to her, though she couldn't explain why. A sudden rustling sound behind her made her spin around, her heart leaping into her throat. Her uncle stood at the edge of the graveyard, his face pale and furious. He was still wearing his coat, as if he had been waiting for her. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment he looked more afraid than angry. "I told you to stay away," he said, his voice low and sharp. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." Elena rose to her feet, squaring her shoulders. "Then explain it to me," she demanded. "Who is Annabelle? Why does her grave glow, and why are you so afraid of her?" Her uncle's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. "It's not your concern," he said. "She's part of the past. Leave it alone, Elena." "No," Elena shot back. "I deserve to know. You've been hiding something bigger than just a glowing grave. What are you so scared of?" For a moment her uncle said nothing. Then, with a heavy sigh, he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Annabelle was wronged," he admitted. "What happened to her was cruel. But if you dig too deep, you'll regret it. Some truths are better left buried." Elena's eyes narrowed. "What did you do to her?" she asked, her voice laced with anger. Her uncle's face hardened. "It wasn't me," he said, "but the family. We all live with the consequences. Leave it alone, Elena. For your sake." With that, he turned and walked back toward the house, leaving her alone in the cold. Elena stared after him, her mind racing. The whispers from the grave lingered in her ears, soft and desperate. She looked back at the glowing headstone, her chest tightening. Whatever her uncle was hiding, she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't walk away now. Not when Annabelle's voice was calling to her. Elena couldn't sleep that night. The whispers from the grave lingered in her mind, weaving through her thoughts like threads of unanswered questions. Her uncle's cryptic warning only deepened her resolve. She needed answers, and she knew the glowing grave was the key to unlocking the truth. The family had buried secrets for years, but Annabelle's grave refused to stay silent. The next morning, Elena woke early, determined to uncover more about Annabelle. She started with the dusty library in the east wing of the house, a room that hadn't been used in decades. The faint smell of mildew and the creak of the warped wooden floor greeted her as she stepped inside. Shelves lined with ancient books and faded ledgers surrounded her. Sunlight filtered through the dirty windows, casting long shadows across the room. She searched through the ledgers, running her fingers over the leather bindings. Most of the records detailed mundane things, financial transactions, property deeds, and family events, but one ledger caught her attention. It was smaller than the others, its spine cracked and its pages yellowed with age. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the handwritten entries. Her breath caught when she found Annabelle's name. The entry was brief but chilling. Annabelle Mallory, accused of poisoning Charles Mallory, sentenced to death. Family records expunged. Resting place unmarked. Elena's hands trembled as she read the words. Annabelle had been erased from the family's history, her name stripped from every record except this one. But why? Was the accusation true, or was it a lie meant to cover up something darker? Her heart sank as she turned the pages, finding no further mention of Annabelle. She closed the ledger and leaned against the desk, her mind racing. If Annabelle had been wrongly accused, who was responsible for the crime? And why had the family gone to such lengths to hide the truth? She decided to search her grandmother's study, hoping to find more clues. The study was locked, but Elena found the key tucked away in a drawer. As she entered the room, she was struck by how untouched it felt, as though her grandmother had stepped out only moments ago. The scent of lavender lingered faintly in the air, and the desk was meticulously organized. On the desk, Elena found a stack of letters bound with a ribbon. She untied them carefully, her fingers brushing over the delicate paper. The letters were addressed to her grandmother, written by someone named Eleanor. The tone of the letters was desperate, filled with pleas for forgiveness and veiled warnings. One letter stood out, its ink smudged and its handwriting shaky. "You've built this family's legacy on lies, and the dead will not rest. Annabelle was innocent, and you knew it. The curse will haunt us all until the truth is revealed. If you won't do what's right, the grave will find a way." Elena's breath quickened as she read the words. The letters revealed a fracture within the family, a struggle between those who wanted to protect their reputation and those who sought to expose the truth. Her grandmother had been at the center of it all, choosing silence over justice. As she placed the letters back on the desk, a faint knock echoed through the study. Elena turned sharply, her heart pounding. No one was there. She stepped into the hallway, her eyes scanning the shadows, but the house was silent. She felt a chill run down her spine as she turned back to the study. On the desk, the letters were gone. Panic surged through her. She had left them there just moments ago. She searched the room frantically, but they had vanished without a trace. The air felt colder, heavier, as though the house itself was watching her. Elena leaned against the desk, trying to steady her breathing. The glowing grave, the whispers, the missing letters. It was all connected, and she was no closer to understanding the full picture. But one thing was clear. Annabelle wasn't the only one hiding secrets. The entire family had blood on their hands, and the truth was buried deeper than she had imagined. Elena paced her room as night fell, her mind racing with everything she had uncovered. The missing letters weighed heavily on her, as did the cryptic entries in the ledger. Every revelation only deepened the mystery, and the glowing grave seemed to grow brighter with each passing night, like a flame demanding attention. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was running out of time. Determined to find more answers, Elena waited until the house fell silent once again. The wind howled outside, rattling the old windows, but inside, the stillness was oppressive. She clutched the flashlight she had found in the kitchen earlier, its faint beam her only source of comfort. Tonight she would search the family vault, a place her uncle had warned her never to enter. The vault was hidden behind a heavy iron door in the basement, concealed by a dusty tapestry. She had seen her uncle retrieve something from it the previous day, though he had been careful to lock it again. Now, as she stood in front of the door, she hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the old key she had taken from his coat pocket. The metal felt cold against her skin, and for a moment she thought she heard faint whispers coming from behind the door. She turned the key slowly, the lock clicking open with an unsettling finality. The door creaked as it swung inward, revealing a narrow staircase leading into darkness. The air was colder here, carrying a damp, metallic scent that made her stomach turn. She descended cautiously, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the confined space. At the bottom of the stairs, the vault opened into a small, dimly lit room. Shelves lined the walls, filled with faded books, strange artifacts, and dusty trinkets. A single lantern flickered weakly on a table in the center of the room, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. Elena's eyes were drawn to a box on the far shelf, its surface engraved with intricate patterns that looked similar to the faint carvings she had seen on Annabelle's grave. She reached for it, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. The lid was stiff, but it opened with a soft creak, revealing a collection of papers and a small locket. The locket was silver, tarnished with age, and engraved with the initials AM. Elena held it up to the light, her breath catching as she noticed a faint glow emanating from it, just like the grave. She opened it carefully, revealing a small portrait of a young woman, Annabelle. Her delicate features were striking, her eyes filled with a sadness that seemed to transcend time. Beneath the locket was a folded piece of parchment. Elena unfolded it slowly, her heart pounding as she read the words written in a hurried, trembling hand. To whoever finds this, I was betrayed by those I called family. I was innocent, but their greed and lies condemned me. My death was not the end, and my name will not be erased. If you seek the truth, bring this locket to my grave and the light will guide you, but beware. The truth carries a price, and the living must face the sins of the dead. Elena's hands shook as she finished reading. The weight of Annabelle's words pressed down on her, heavy with the pain of a life stolen too soon. She slipped the locket into her pocket, her resolve solidifying. The answers she needed were at the grave, waiting for her. But as she turned to leave the vault, a shadow moved in the corner of her vision. She froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The shadow shifted again, taking shape. A tall, imposing figure standing in the doorway. It was her uncle, his face pale and furious, his eyes dark with anger. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice low and sharp. His gaze fell to the open box, and his expression darkened. "You don't know what you're messing with." Elena stepped back, clutching the locket tightly. "I know enough," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Annabelle was innocent. She was betrayed by this family, and you've been hiding it all these years." Her uncle's jaw tightened, his fists clenched at his sides. "You think you're doing the right thing, but you have no idea what you're waking up," he said. "Annabelle's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was the beginning of something far worse. If you bring that locket to her grave, you won't just uncover the truth, you'll unleash it." Elena stared at him, her chest tight with anger and determination. "Maybe it's time the truth was unleashed," she said. Before he could stop her, she darted past him, the locket burning cold against her skin as she made her way back upstairs. The whispers began again as she reached the top of the stairs, faint and urgent. They seemed to guide her, pulling her toward the graveyard. She didn't care about her uncle's warnings anymore. Annabelle's voice was calling to her, and she was ready to listen. The night air was colder than before, sharp and biting against Elena's skin as she stepped outside. The sky was a deep black, the stars obscured by thick clouds that seemed to press down on the earth. The graveyard lay ahead, silent and foreboding, with the faint glow of Annabelle's grave piercing through the darkness like a lighthouse on a stormy sea. Elena's footsteps crunched on the frozen grass as she approached the iron gate. It groaned on its hinges as she pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. She clutched the locket tightly in her hand, its cold surface digging into her palm. Every step she took felt heavier, as though the earth itself resisted her, but she pressed on, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. When she reached the grave, the glow intensified, casting long shadows across the surrounding headstones. She knelt in front of the marker, brushing her fingers over the engraved letters of Annabelle's name. The air around her seemed to hum faintly, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. With trembling hands, she held the locket up to the grave. The moment it came into contact with the soil, the ground beneath her began to shake. The glow flared brighter, forcing her to shield her eyes. A low, mournful sound filled the air like a distant wail carried on the wind. "Elena!" The whisper was louder now, clear and unmistakable. It wasn't just a sound, it was a voice, soft and filled with pain. She looked up to see a faint figure emerging from the light. Annabelle stood before her, translucent and glowing, her face as beautiful as it was sorrowful. Her eyes met Elena's, and for a moment time seemed to stop. "You found it," Annabelle said, her voice echoing as though it came from somewhere far away. "You found the truth." Elena swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "I know what they did to you. I know you were innocent." Annabelle's expression softened, but there was a sadness in her eyes that cut through Elena like a knife. "They took everything from me," she said. "My name, my life, my peace. And yet, they thrived while I was left to suffer." Tears welled up in Elena's eyes. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to give you peace." Annabelle reached out, her hand passing through Elena's as though she were made of mist. "You've done more than you know," she said. "The locket was the key to unlocking my voice, but the curse runs deeper than me. It is tied to the bloodline, to the lies that built this family. If the truth is not revealed, it will destroy you all." Elena's breath caught. "What do I have to do?" Annabelle's figure flickered, her light dimming slightly. "The confession," she said. "The sins they buried with me must be brought to light. Burn the lies, expose the truth, and the curse will end. But be warned, the cost will be great." Before Elena could respond, the ground beneath the grave cracked, releasing a blinding light that swallowed Annabelle's figure. The glow faded, leaving only darkness and silence in its wake. The locket in Elena's hand grew warm, its surface smooth and unmarked, as though it had been freed from its burden. Elena knelt there for a long moment, the weight of Annabelle's words pressing down on her. The truth had to be exposed, but the thought of what it might cost sent a chill through her. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady, and turned back toward the house. The confession was in the vault, hidden among the artifacts of her family's dark past. If she was going to end this, she had to retrieve it, and she had to be ready for whatever came next. Hyosina returned to the house, the locket heavy in her pocket as if it carried the weight of Annabelle's pain. The whispers had gone silent, leaving an eerie stillness in the air. She slipped inside and closed the door quietly, her ears straining for any sound. The mansion was dark, the faint glow of moonlight spilling through the windows and casting twisted shadows on the walls. Her uncle's warning echoed in her mind, but she pushed it aside. Annabelle had spoken to her, and Elena knew what she had to do. The basement vault was her destination. She moved through the house cautiously, her flashlight beam guiding her steps. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a thunderclap in the quiet, but no one stirred. When she reached the tapestry covering the vault door, she hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. She felt the same oppressive energy as before, but this time she didn't let it stop her. She pushed the door open and descended the narrow staircase into the cold, dimly lit room. The lantern on the table flickered faintly, casting uneven light across the shelves. Elena moved quickly, her eyes scanning the artifacts and papers until she found what she was looking for, the box she had opened earlier. Inside was the folded parchment Annabelle had mentioned, the one that carried the confession. Elena picked it up, her hands trembling as she unfolded the brittle paper. The ink was faded but legible, the words written in her great-grandmother's hand. "Annabelle was innocent. I accused her to protect the family. Her death ensured our survival. But the curse began with her. She cursed us with her dying breath, binding our fortune to her suffering. As long as her name remains forgotten, we thrive. But the cost is her eternal unrest. Forgive me, Annabelle. May God forgive me too." Elena's breath hitched. Her great-grandmother had sacrificed Annabelle to protect the family's wealth and reputation, knowing full well she was innocent. The betrayal was monstrous, and the curse was more than justified. Her family had lived on the fruits of Annabelle's suffering for generations, their fortune tied to her torment. The ground beneath her feet trembled slightly, and the air grew colder. She glanced around the room, her heart racing. The locket in her pocket began to burn, and a faint whisper rose from the shadows. "Burn the lies," it said, Annabelle's voice soft but commanding. Helena grabbed the lantern from the table and placed the confession in its weak flame. The parchment caught fire, the edges curling as the flames consumed the words. As the confession burned, the room seemed to exhale, the oppressive energy lifting. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Expose the truth." She knew what she had to do next. The confession wasn't enough. Her family's lies had to be brought into the light. She took the ashes of the parchment and the locket and left the vault, heading toward the dining room where her uncle and aunt had gathered earlier that evening. The fire in the hearth had long since died, but the room still carried the weight of their presence. Elena placed the locket and the ashes on the table, her hands steady despite the adrenaline surging through her. She sat down and waited, the silence thick around her. It didn't take long before she heard footsteps approaching. Her uncle was the first to enter, his face pale and drawn. He froze when he saw the locket and the ashes, his expression shifting from confusion to fury. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice low and trembling. "I found the confession," Elena said calmly. "I know the truth about Annabelle. She was innocent, and you all knew it. The curse isn't just hers, it's ours." Her aunt appeared in the doorway, her hand covering her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. "Elena, you don't understand," she said softly. "We did what we had to. If the truth comes out, the family will be ruined." "The family should be ruined," Elena shot back, her voice rising. "You've lived off her suffering for decades. You let her die for your greed, and now you're all too cowardly to face what you've done." Her uncle slammed his fist on the table. "You've doomed us all," he shouted. "The curse was contained, but now—" Before he could finish, the house shook violently, the walls groaning as if in pain. The faint glow of Annabelle's grave spilled through the windows, brighter than ever. The whispers returned, louder and angrier, echoing through the house. Elena stood her ground, her heart racing. "This isn't Annabelle's doing," she said, her voice steady. "This is the curse breaking. The truth is finally coming out, and it's not hers to carry anymore." The glow outside intensified, and the whispers turned into a roar. Her uncle and aunt clung to each other, their faces pale with terror. The house shook one last time before falling silent, the glow outside fading into darkness. Elena felt the locket in her pocket grow warm, its surface smooth and cool now. She stepped outside, the air crisp and clear. The graveyard was still, the glow from Annabelle's grave gone. The oppressive weight that had hung over the estate was lifted, replaced by a strange, bittersweet calm. As Elena stood there, she heard one last whisper, soft and full of gratitude. "Thank you." The graveyard was silent once more, but Elena knew the family's legacy would never be the same. The curse was gone, but the scars of the truth would remain. And for the first time in generations, Annabelle's name would no longer be forgotten.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.